بسم الله والحمد لله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على Mustafa. In this session, Fiqh of Dawah Part 2, we want to talk about some concepts which are very important and rarely heard in the discussion, which is branded or labeled as Fiqh of Dawah or understanding Dawah. When we look at the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, many of us who concern ourselves with trying to understand their lives, and many of those who, even if they only attempt to understand at a surface level, understand, comprehend, come to realize that the companions were ones who immediately, at least as they're described, immediately when a command descended from on high, were able to divest themselves or able to break from their past and engage in the immediate performance of what was being asked. In other words, there was not much discussion, there was not much thought. They immediately stopped that action which was prohibited to them, and they engaged in that action which was commanded of them. This understanding, although in principle may be true, neglects the reality that Islam manifested itself in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A period of 13 years. And in this period, which we can refer to study in detail, the time of Mecca. In this period, in the time of Mecca in Islamic history, we see that there was a gradual transformation that took place. And the deeper you go into the lives of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you see that they brought to his attention a number of problems that they had. Whether it was the problem of drinking or the problem of adultery, they brought a number of problems to him, and these issues were gradually addressed. There was no such thing as imposing upon the people a system of laws which they themselves were not even prepared to accommodate into their lives on a spiritual or psychological or even a habitual basis. So that's why we see that this period in the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a period in which the Muslims underwent not only detoxification from intoxicants, but also a spiritual transformation and an intellectual transformation about how they thought about life and the world. Unfortunately, when we deal with the convert community, from those who have never been Muslims and those who are born of Muslim parents but never practice Islam, we begin to observe a psychology of anxiety. And that's that many times we're really not understanding the background of the person that is coming into Islam, the challenges that that person may face. And many times we're not even coming to comprehend the details of that background in such a way that we will be able to determine whether that person comes from a background of mental illness imposed or inherited. Now, what I mean by that is this. There are some people that come from backgrounds in which there's a history of mental illness within their families. And there are some people they come into Islam and they unfortunately now experience mental illness because of the actions which they engaged prior to coming into Islam. So if we have someone who was a drug user for a long period of time and combine that with alcohol and combine that with a family structure which was collapsed or near to collapse, then we have a case of someone who's going to be oriented in a certain way, is going to respond to reality in a certain way. And a lot of times we underestimate this, especially the impact of drugs and alcohol in dysfunctional families in shaping the character of the new Muslim. Shaping the character of the new Muslim. So the personality of the new Muslim is very important for us to understand that person as an individual and then be able to address the needs of the person. But the psychology of anxiety is one in which the person is always anxious about life, concerned, worried, and it even goes into some bouts of depression. But the psychology of anxiety becomes a problem when practicing the deen. When practicing the deen, because the person begins to understand Islam in a particular way. The person begins to become anxious about practicing various aspects of Islam and sometimes becomes very rigid. And in this rigidity, understands life to be very, very narrow as far as its pleasures are concerned and its good. In other words, the person begins to have a problem with understanding exactly how to action and how to act and how to function in life. They become very anxious about everything, and this is something that was within their personality prior to coming to Islam. And so they begin to interpret Islam from this position of anxiety or anxiousness. The orientation that we begin to see is emotional imbalance at this point. We begin to see emotional imbalance. And this is coming from my observations. I haven't performed any clinical studies, but this is coming from the observation of a person dealing with the community and talking to imams and talking to social workers and so on and so forth, and observing in particular the new Muslim community or the new Muslim converts. Another problem that we have is the problem of relativism. And that is not necessarily understanding what are the boundaries of right and wrong. When we have a person that has been engaging in a certain lifestyle in which they really pay little attention to the whole concept of right and wrong, prohibited, unprohibited, and then we bring them into Islam after they convert on their own into a process of trying to understand what it is that Allah is asking of them. If we're not careful, we run into a problem in which we have a person, one, that's anxious, two, a person which has never been exposed on a daily basis to this whole concept of prohibited and unprohibited things and so on and so forth. They're used to a life in which things are determined by the moment, by feeling, sometimes by reason, sometimes by religious background, sometimes by family upbringing. So now they're confronted with a bunch of rules. Unfortunately, some of our brothers are introduced to Islam in this way. Now they're confronted by a bunch of rules. Well, they come from a background, some of them, not all of them, some of them in which they perhaps have made some bad moral decisions. So when you have somebody that has a background, a criminal background, or you have somebody that uh, was an abusive person, or you have somebody that was engaging in alcohol and drugs and so on and so forth, in free sex and so on and so forth. These are the worst case scenarios. But when you have a person with that type of background, they themselves are clouded on what's right and wrong. They themselves have crossed a boundary which many people, even non-Muslims, may not have crossed in their own lives. And so what begins to take place is that there is a confusion about how to perceive the world. The world becomes interpreted through the lens of that past. So this increases the psychology of anxiety and creates a problem in which a person becomes very constrained. And as the person is attempting to completely change self, an adaptive change is taking place. And consequently, cognitive dissonance means what you believe is not necessarily what you may be practicing. They may be still struggling with practicing Islam or even leaving some habits or coming to understand what's being demanded of Islam or how do I implement this, that adaptive change. And this can be the case with people who may not necessarily have a very uh, tough and disorienting background. It's just a new convert. The same is applied to the new convert, that there's a psychology of anxiety there with the new convert here. I mean, the new convert who hasn't really engaged in a background which is self-destructive. Just a person who has come into Islam. Same scenario, except that maybe the anxiety is not there to the same extent initially, but we begin to see the anxiety develop while change is taking place, while the person is becoming accustomed to practicing certain aspects of Islam and then trying to see how they relate to relatives, how they relate to friends, how they relate to society. That cognitive dissonance begins to kick in between what they now believe and how they're practicing, or what they believed in the past and now what they're practicing, or what they believed before and now what they believe now. There's a number of different scenarios. But cognitive dissonance is something that needs to be studied in order to kind of explain this phenomena of what's taking place within the mind of the convert. So what we begin to see then now is disorientation. If there's no knowledge that's being communicated here at this point systematically, what we begin to see is a person begin to interpret Islam on their own. And this is a crisis. A person interpreting Islam on his or her own and having these challenges and struggles. The emotion and the feeling that comes along with being anxious, that comes along with being confused about what's right or wrong, that comes along with being a stranger to a new way of life, that comes along with abandoning that which you knew or considering that which you believe to be false. There is a deep transformation that is beginning to take place within the self. And that's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. And sometimes what we begin to find is people retreat. Their practice becomes problematic. And they begin to retreat into their old habits as a means to feel comfortable with themselves in life. Some people may leave Islam entirely, and others may become very stringent in an effort to deal with the relativism that they now experience, because they are seeing that people live in a lot of different ways, and now they're trying to determine what's right. So then they begin to fall back on painting the world in a very narrow sense as a way to make sense of what is right and wrong and what is taking place in themselves and how they will deal with this new change of life. The suggestion here then is that those of us who are doing dawah, we should use Quranic therapy. And what I mean by Quranic therapy is to deal with those aspects of the Quran which present the universe and life in such a way that it is positive and full of meaning and beneficial and good. And to focus on those aspects of the Quran which speak about good deeds, and to present the reality of the practice of Islam as being one which was introduced gradually to the Muslim community. And then, by means of the Quran, memorizing the Quran, coming to know its meanings, uh, sitting and studying those aspects of the Quran, those verses of the Quran, which focus on empowerment and self-transformation and hope, which focus on good deeds and so on and so forth, and trying to model the personality that's being developed upon these type of principles. Before focusing on punishment, before focusing on preservation of identity, other aspects of the Quran which are important, but which, if taken to study, if they are studied within the mindset of anxiety, the philosophy of relativism, where the person is not sure what's right and wrong, and within the context of cognitive dissonance, where the person is experiencing anxiety because there's a difference between what the person is believing and what the person is doing. There's stress that develops there, that we begin to introduce certain aspects of Islam or the Quran itself. Then what we do is we contribute to the stress of the individual, to the cognitive dissonance, to the perception of everything being relative, and to the psychology of anxiety. Because most likely, a person that's coming into Islam, they're still going to be dealing with the past that they have to struggle with. And I'm concerned here with those who have a very strong past, a past at which they may feel disgust about, or a past which is unhealthy. Those individuals that have a past which is overburdening, they will be the ones to struggle with themselves the most. They will be the ones that will struggle to understand Islam and go through bouts of confusion, experience deep anxiety and consequently stress because of the way they interpret the world, will accentuate, will make even more sharp their anxiety. And this can plunge a person into depression if they're not already depressed. So we need to encourage Quranic therapy, those aspects of the Quran embodied in chapters and verses, like the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, is a story of hope and triumph, transformation. It's a story in which a person is abandoned by their significant others. But this story can serve as a model to help the convert adjust in this time of change. Scenarios such as that we find in the Quran, or particular verses which talk about distress, which talk about despair, themes to that nature. With that in mind, we need to keep emphasizing incremental change and empowerment of the individual. empowerment of the individual emotionally, empowerment of the individual intellectually, empowerment of the individual economically, and hopefully empowerment of the individual socially to the point where the person begins to contribute back to society. As a Muslim, we don't want to generate a dawah which is going to alienate the person from the environment that he or she lives in to such an extent that the person finds difficulty in living life. Now, there may be some environments that are extremely negative, and those type of environments may be toxic. Those realities have to be identified when counseling new Muslims, when counseling Muslims in general and people in general. But what I mean is that we don't want people to feel so disconnected from society that they become dysfunctional now because they became Muslim. They find a solution and a refuge in Islam, and then they don't allow Islam to influence themselves or influence the self to such an extent that they can become functional in society and have a sense of peace and happiness within themselves. So definitely in the fiqh of da'wah, we have to understand how change affects people. We have to pay attention to the small cues which indicate that people are experiencing anxiety, they're experiencing depression, they're experiencing a sense of not fitting in, they're experiencing cognitive dissonance. And this is where I think we can get some benefit from contemporary psychological insights into understanding exactly where a person is at emotionally and in relation to their past. Because we have so many Muslims nowadays, people that become Muslim that have experienced trauma. So their traumatic experiences carry with them. And when they carry with them, they begin to have this sense that Islam wipes everything out and gives them a new beginning. But then they find that they confront the same emotions, the same problems, the same instinctual responses, and the same family background, and the same psychological flashbacks that they had in the past. And they begin to have an affinity for the things that they used to do. And if it's in the negative, what they used to do in their background, it will increase whatever traumatic experience they have had. Maybe some people suffer from molestation. Maybe some people suffer from uh, violence, either observing violence or participating in violence. There are a number of scenarios that could be drawn up. But whatever may be the case, if there was a traumatic experience and there was a checkered background or a difficult background that a person experienced, when these things interact with one another and they stay within the person, when that person comes into Islam, they will have difficulty in practicing and they will have difficulty in transforming themselves. That's why I wanted to pay attention to the psychology of anxiety. When we begin to see a person that is constantly anxious, when we begin to see a person that came from a background in which they made a lot of bad choices, we begin to see that there may be a soft moral relativism there where the moral moorings, their boundaries are not really set very well. When we begin to see a person that's transforming at a fast pace or even at a slow pace, what is the mindset there? We see that adaptive change in which a person is trying to be sincere and changing themselves will lead to cognitive dissonance. So then we have to be aware of how it is that we will introduce a Quranic therapy. How is it that we will introduce the study of the Quran to that person's situation? And in any event, we should always promote incremental change, and we should always be there as a source of empowerment emotionally, intellectually, and encourage economic empowerment. I'm not saying that the masajid or institutions are in a position uh, to just give money to people. Some institutions I know do that. They try to help people with sadaqah and zakat. But we have to have a mindset of being able to do for self and being interested in business and being interested in promoting one's career and so on and so forth. And this is especially the case among converts, that they need to have a sense of the importance of economic empowerment, and that whatever challenge they may confront in that arena, then they need to be able to pinpoint those behaviors and those attitudes which are obstacles and which don't allow them to overcome their challenges, toward empowering them in such a way that they can become strong economically, so that they're able to provide for themselves, provide for their families, and give back to the community and give to society. So, in brief, this reflection on the fiqh of da'wah regards the emotions and the psychology of the new Muslim convert, whether the person was practicing Islam and then stopped practicing, whether the person came to Islam new, whether the person was born into Islam but never practiced. Whoever begins to practice with sincerity and with the committed renewal, in some sense, is a convert. And this is what we call the people of Tawbah. The people of Tawbah. The people who repent for what they have done that is wrong, and they transform or they convert towards that which is better. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله والحمد لله والحمد لله رب العالمين.